7 sisters, 7 untouched beds, and an entire Montana town left terrified on a cold October morning in 1899. The Thornfield family's story isn't just a mystery. It's a chilling secret buried for decades, locked away in government files and tied to greed, corruption, and a hidden network no one dared speak of. What happened that night would become one of the darkest unsolved disappearances in American history. Have you ever heard of a mystery so strange, so chilling, that it left an entire town haunted for generations? That's exactly what happened on the morning of October 13th, 1899, in the quiet Montana town of Selkirk. Inside the grand Thornfield home, 7 beds were perfectly made, their covers tucked tight as if no one had slept in them. But the rooms felt hollow, lifeless, like tombs that had never held the living. The 7 Thornfield sisters, Margaret, 26, Catherine, 24, twins Eleanor and Elizabeth, 22, Sarah, 20, Grace, Wooden, Rebecca, just 14, were gone, completely vanished. Not a footprint, not a whisper. Even the frost on the windowsills was untouched. No broken locks, no forced doors. Their nightgowns still hanging neatly where they'd left them before bed, as if the girls had simply dissolved into the autumn air. When the sheriff investigated, his report, later sealed by the federal government for nearly 80 years, revealed something terrifying. Every room had been searched, not in a clumsy, frantic way, but carefully, methodically, by someone who knew the house inside and out. And yet, not a single thing was missing. Jewelry, money, clothing, all untouched. What really happened to the Thornfield sisters? And why did the government bury the truth? As the years passed, whispers began to spread. This wasn't just a disappearance. It was tied to corruption, greed, and human trafficking, a hidden network that stretched far beyond Selkirk. Back then, Selkirk was no ordinary mining town. In the late 1800s, it had transformed from a rough frontier outpost into a booming hub of opportunity, fueled by silver ore and the newly built Northern Pacific Railroad. Nearly 800 people called it home. The streets were alive with wagons hauling silver, businessmen stepping off trains from Chicago and New York, and families chasing new lives in the West. But beneath the bustle, there were fractures. Old families resented wealthy newcomers, miners clashed with investors, and troubling rumors spread about young women who arrived full of promise, only to vanish under vague explanations, their families left behind in silence and grief. At the heart of it all stood Gabriel Thornfield, the sisters' father. He was seen as a legend in the community, a widowed merchant who had arrived in 1892 with nothing but a wagon of supplies and 7 daughters. His wife had died on the journey west, leaving him to raise the girls alone. The townsfolk had helped him get started, and within 2 years, his modest general store had grown into the largest trading business between Butte and Missoula. He made lucrative deals with mining companies, struck connections in Chicago and San Francisco, and built one of the grandest Victorian mansions in the region. To the outside world, he was a symbol of success and resilience. The Thornfield daughters, meanwhile, became admired in their own right. Margaret, the eldest, was a brilliant teacher whose progressive methods shaped Selkirk's school into one of the best in the territory. Catherine, just behind her, inherited her mother's gift for art, creating work that inspired the whole community. Each sister brought something unique, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the town. And then, in a single night, they were gone. No warning. No trace, only a locked-away sheriff's report and a silence that lasted decades. So, what really happened behind the closed doors of the Thornfield mansion? And why would federal agents erase the truth? That's what we're about to uncover. The story of the Thornfield sisters doesn't just reveal a family tragedy. It exposes a dark, hidden network that preyed on women across the American frontier. A network the powerful didn't want anyone to discover. And what came next would shake Selkirk to its core. Have you ever wondered how a family could seem so perfect, so admired, and yet be hiding at the center of one of the darkest mysteries in American history? The Thornfield sisters weren't just well-liked. They were the very heart of Selkirk, Montana. Take Catherine, for example. Her paintings didn't just hang on walls. They defined the town. Sweeping Montana landscapes, portraits that seemed to breathe life, even still lifes that turned simple objects into beauty. Her art filled homes and businesses alike. And she didn't stop there. Catherine organized concerts, art shows, and literary evenings that gave Selkirk a taste of sophistication most frontier towns never dreamed of. Then there were the twins, Elena and Elizabeth. Always together, always in step. They had turned their skill with a needle into a thriving seamstress shop, employing local women and making everything from basic mending to elaborate wedding gowns. Their shop wasn't just a business. It became a place where women gathered to share stories, discuss town matters, and lean on each other through the hardships of frontier life. Outwardly identical, the twins were opposites in spirit. Elena was outgoing and practical, while Elizabeth had a quiet, thoughtful nature that made her a trusted confidant for half the town. Sarah, at just 20, had a voice that could fill Selkirk's Methodist church with ease. She wasn't only a singer, she was a force of compassion. Sarah led the choir, organized holiday pageants that drew crowds from across the valley, and raised funds for families devastated by mining accidents. To many, she was the soul of Selkirk, a young woman who carried the suffering of others with grace and determination. Grace, at 17, shocked everyone with her brilliance in mathematics. She could run numbers in her head faster than most could write them down. Compound interest, multiple ledgers at once, spotting errors seasoned bookkeepers missed. Grace made it look effortless. Her father trusted her advice on business matters, and businessmen from far and wide whispered that she had one of the sharpest minds they'd ever encountered, regardless of her age. And then there was Rebecca, only 14, the youngest, bright, playful, the kind of child whose laughter could lift even the bleakest Montana winter day. She volunteered at the library, reading stories to children whose parents worked endless shifts in the mines. She was everyone's little sister, beloved for her kindness, her warmth, and the promise of who she would become. The Thornfields weren't just admired. They were woven into the very fabric of Selkirk. But with admiration came suspicion. Some whispered about Gabriel Thornfield, the father. How had a man who arrived in town with almost nothing suddenly built one of the largest businesses in the region? How had he financed such a grand Victorian mansion, the pride of Maple Street? People noticed his late-night meetings with well-dressed strangers arriving on the train, slipping away before dawn. Deals whispered behind closed doors in his study. And the more the town speculated, the more uneasy Gabriel seemed to become. The truth was, the Thornfields weren't just living through a family story. They were caught in the storm shaping the entire American West. The country was still reeling from the devastating economic depression of 1893. Families struggled, mines closed, banks failed, and tensions between miners and owners erupted into violent clashes across Montana, Colorado, and Idaho. The Western Federation of Miners was gaining strength, demanding fair pay and safer working conditions, while Eastern investors, men with money but no ties to the frontier, demanded profits at any cost. Business owners like Gabriel Thornfield stood trapped in the middle of it all, balancing loyalty to their workers against the pressure of powerful financiers. And then came the railroads. The Northern Pacific Line reached Selkirk in 1896, and with it came prosperity, but also danger. Wherever the railroad went, crime followed. Con men, land speculators, organized gangs. Communities that had once been isolated suddenly found themselves exposed to forces far larger and more dangerous than they realized. And so, by the autumn of 1899, the tension in Selkirk was like a coiled spring. Whispers of corruption, strangers slipping through town, and a family, the Thornfields, at the center of it all. October 12th began like any other day. The air was crisp, the streets lined with gold and crimson leaves. Gabriel opened his store right at 7 like clockwork. His daughters carried out their daily routines with the same familiar rhythm as always, but there were small cracks. Margaret, the eldest, walked to the schoolhouse that morning with her satchel in hand. Parents noticed she seemed distracted. Her usually sharp attention was dulled, her answers absent-minded. Some even recalled her clothes appeared just a little untidy, so unlike her usual meticulous self. Little details, easy to dismiss at the time, but in hindsight, chilling signs that something was about to change forever. What happened next would leave Selkirk and the entire nation stunned for generations. So don't go anywhere. What if the last day of your life looked completely ordinary, but underneath everything was unraveling? That's what witnesses in Selkirk would later realize about October 12, 1899, the day before the Thornfield sisters disappeared forever. That morning, Catherine set up her easel in the garden behind the family home. She'd been working on a fall landscape of the Bitterroot Mountains for weeks, but neighbors noticed something strange. Mrs. Henrietta Walsh, who often watched from across the street, said Catherine just couldn't seem to focus. She kept pacing, setting her brush down, staring toward the train station as if waiting for something or someone, and instead of working steadily, she painted the same tiny section of canvas again and again, almost like her hands wouldn't obey her mind. The twins, Elena and Elizabeth, opened their seamstress shop at 9. They were busy on the biggest project in town, a wedding dress for the mayor's daughter. Normally their shop was filled with laughter and chatter, but that day, nervous whispers. Conversations cut short the second a customer walked in. Dorothy Fleming, who stopped by with a jacket, later said the twins seemed rattled, fumbling their measurements, starting over, making mistakes they'd never usually make. Over at the Methodist church, Sarah was practicing hymns. Her voice usually carried through the rafters, pitch perfect. But Reverend Atwood noticed it was shaky, uncertain. She kept pausing, gazing out the windows toward Main Street. When he asked if she was unwell, Sarah brushed him off, said it was nothing, but the Reverend remembered she refused his offer to call a doctor, and that was very unlike her. Grace, usually her father's brilliant right hand in the general store, wasn't herself either. Customers saw her making math errors, mistakes so simple they didn't even seem possible for someone with her talent. Even Gabriel, the father, looked uneasy. He kept checking his pocket watch, glancing toward the street, like he was waiting for something that wasn't arriving. And even Rebecca, the youngest, so full of life, seemed weighed down. Helping the housekeeper with chores, she asked unsettling questions for a 14-year-old. Questions about travel, about leaving family behind, about whether you could ever truly be happy far away from the people you loved. Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, remembered those words vividly. Looking back, she believed Rebecca was reaching out in her own quiet way. By mid-afternoon, the unease had become undeniable. Around 3 p.m., Dr. Samuel Porter was riding home from a visit when he saw something that froze him in his tracks. All 7 sisters walking together down River Street toward the train depot. That alone was odd. They rarely left the house all at once except for church. But it was their faces, their silence, that unsettled him most. Normally cheerful and warm, they moved in stiff, almost mechanical unison. Determined but grim, like soldiers heading into a battle they didn't choose. Dr. Porter called out a friendly greeting. None of the sisters replied. Only Rebecca turned her head. And what he saw in her eyes haunted him for the rest of his life. Terror, pure, unmistakable terror. He later swore she was silently pleading for help. But whatever was happening, she couldn't say it aloud. The last confirmed sighting came that night. Around 9:15 p.m., Timothy Fletcher, the telegraph clerk, looked out from his office window and saw the sisters standing together beneath the glow of a street lamp. At first, he thought he imagined it. They stood so perfectly still, lined up, facing the train station. Not talking, not laughing, just waiting. And there was something else. Their clothing. Instead of their usual work dresses, the sisters wore their finest gowns, the kind reserved for church or special events. Hair carefully styled, jewelry gleaming in the lamplight. But their faces didn't show excitement, no joy, only resignation, fear, like women preparing not for a celebration, but for an ordeal they couldn't escape. Fletcher glanced back at his work. 10 minutes later, he looked again. The street lamp was empty. They were gone. What happened inside the Thornfield house that night is still a mystery. The only account came from Gabriel himself, and his story was riddled with contradictions and missing pieces, and that, perhaps, is the most disturbing part of all, because the sisters' final hours, from Catherine's restless brushstrokes, to Rebecca's fearful glance, to that haunting last sight beneath the street lamp, tell us one thing. They knew something was coming, and it terrified them. What if I told you an entire household could vanish in a single night and leave behind nothing but perfect order where chaos should have been? That's exactly what happened inside the Thornfield home on the night of October 12, 1899. Gabriel Thornfield told Sheriff Harding that his evening was completely ordinary. At 10 p.m., he settled into his study to read letters and update his business records, something he did every night without fail. For the next 90 minutes, he claimed he never left the room. At the same time, Mrs. Caldwell, the family's housekeeper, finished her duties and left for her cottage at exactly 10, just as she always did. But before she walked out, she noticed something that unsettled her deeply. The house was too quiet, not just peaceful, but unnaturally still. No footsteps on the stairs. No sisters chatting in their rooms. Not even the usual creaks of the old wooden beams. And stranger still, none of the sisters had laid out their clothes for the morning or prepared for their busy day ahead. It was as if everything had just stopped. Gabriel later said that by 11:30, he did his usual routine, checked the locks, said a short prayer in the chapel, and went to bed in the master bedroom he'd occupied alone since his wife's death. He swore he slept soundly all night, hearing nothing unusual, but what the evidence revealed later made that claim hard to believe. At dawn, Mrs. Caldwell returned to begin breakfast. Her key turned smoothly in the lock. The front door was secure, just as she had left it. But inside, she was struck by a silence so heavy that she later said it felt like stepping into a tomb. No movement, no voices. Not even the ordinary ticking of clocks seemed right. At first, she thought perhaps the family had overslept, but when she walked into the kitchen, she froze. Every evening, the sisters gathered for tea and a light snack before bed. Yet the kitchen looked untouched, clean, organized, and exactly as she had left it the night before. Her unease growing, Mrs. Caldwell climbed the staircase to the sisters' bedrooms. The hall was eerily still, doors closed. She knocked on Margaret's room. No answer. Pushing the door open, she found a sight that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The bed was perfectly made. Corners tucked, pillows aligned. Her nightgown still hung neatly on its hook. Books and lesson plans for the next day sat ready on the desk. To the untrained eye, nothing was wrong, but Mrs. Caldwell knew better. Margaret's belongings were off, books reshelved in the wrong order, papers clumsily stacked by someone who didn't understand her meticulous system. Next, she entered Catherine's room. Normally, Catherine's creative chaos filled the space, canvases leaning against walls, paint scattered everywhere. But on this morning, everything was disturbingly neat, too neat. Brushes aligned, canvases stacked, every surface spotless, as if someone had erased all traces of who Catherine really was. And then came the twins' room. Elena and Elizabeth always kept their things in perfect symmetry, a reflection of their bond. But what Mrs. Caldwell found inside was even stranger. The twins' bedroom was the first true shock. Normally a mirror image of neatness, that morning it felt wrong. Drawers had been opened, clothes pulled out and then folded back hastily, but not in the exacting way the sisters always kept them. Someone had been rifling through their lives, trying to put things back just right, but failing. Mrs. Caldwell's horror deepened as she climbed to the third floor. Sarah's room, Grace's, Rebecca's, all the same story. Beds that had never been slept in. Nightgowns untouched. Belongings clearly disturbed, as if searched by someone who knew the house. But not the women who lived there. That's when she broke. Her screams tore through the stillness, echoing down Selkirk's quiet streets. Neighbors rushed to her side as she cried out the unthinkable. "They're gone! The girls are gone!" Gabriel Thornfield, startled awake by the commotion, at first refused to believe it. He stormed through his home, calling his daughters' names, searching every room, desperate for a logical explanation. But there wasn't one. Instead, he found the same chilling evidence Mrs. Caldwell had. 7 rooms abandoned, yet carefully searched. Every item examined, every drawer opened. Nothing missing, but nothing untouched. Sheriff William Harding arrived within minutes. A seasoned lawman, he'd dealt with drunken brawls, theft, even killings. But this, 7 women vanishing without a trace, from a locked house with no struggle, no break-in, no footprints in the damp earth outside. It was unlike anything he'd ever faced. His inspection only raised more questions. Every door and window locked from the inside. No tampering, no forced entry. And outside, not a single track in the soft ground, as if no one had come or gone at all. Inside, the truth became impossible to ignore. Each room told the same story. Clothes unfolded and refolded. Jewelry boxes opened, examined, and closed again. Personal letters pulled out, read, and then stacked in the wrong order. Whoever had done this wasn't stealing. They were searching, and yet, nothing of value was missing. Not money, not jewelry, not even sentimental keepsakes. Harding began questioning the townsfolk, and slowly, a far stranger picture came into focus. For weeks leading up to the disappearance, residents had noticed well-dressed strangers stepping off the evening trains. Men in fine Eastern suits carrying expensive leather cases. They'd meet quietly with a few prominent townsmen, then vanish on the next morning's train. No friendly visits, no community dinners, no small-town chatter. Just in and out like ghosts. The telegraph office confirmed it too, an unusual flood of coded messages being wired out to New York, Chicago, San Francisco. Random strings of numbers and letters that meant nothing to the clerks. But someone knew what they meant. Most of those messages, they came from Gabriel Thornfield himself, though he wasn't the only one. A handful of other influential men in Selkirk were doing the same. And then came the discovery that cast Gabriel's rising fortune in an even darker light. The town banker, Charles Whitman, finally admitted that Gabriel had been making massive gold withdrawals for months. Huge sums that didn't match his usual patterns. And each withdrawal, it lined up almost perfectly with the visits of those mysterious strangers from the east. Whatever was happening in Selkirk wasn't random. It wasn't just a disappearance. It was part of something bigger. Something planned, hidden, and dangerous. And the Thornfield sisters? They were right at the center of it. What if I told you? The biggest mystery in Selkirk, Montana, didn't just involve 7 vanished sisters, but a web of money, power, and corruption that reached all the way across the American West. See, Gabriel Thornfield wasn't just a grieving father. His business records revealed something far darker. His bank deposits, his investments, they didn't match the modest profits of a frontier general store, not even close. Even with the silver boom making Selkirk a prosperous little town, Gabriel's fortune grew at a pace that simply didn't add up. Whitman's ledgers showed steady payments from wealthy sources back east, payments that skyrocketed in the months before his daughters disappeared. And as winter closed in, the case stopped being just a local tragedy. It became a national obsession. Reporters swarmed in from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, sketching haunting portraits of the sisters and spinning theories that ranged from abduction to murder, to something even stranger. That's when the Department of Justice stepped in. Inspector Marcus Reed, a man known for cracking down on cross-territory crime, took control of the investigation. And what he uncovered sent shockwaves through Washington. Gabriel's finances weren't just suspicious. They were tied to something far bigger. Mining claims, railroad contracts, government appointments, and at the center of it all, an elusive organization called the Rocky Mountain Development Company. Now, this wasn't just some backroom partnership. It was a sprawling empire built on shell corporations, proxy buyers, and endless layers of secrecy. Reed could only trace the edges. But one thing was clear. This group was swallowing up the West, its mines, its land, its political leaders, while ordinary towns like Selkirk never stood a chance. Gabriel Thornfield, he was no innocent storekeeper. He was their man on the inside. His job was simple: feed them intel. Who owned what land? Which mines were worth buying? Which politicians could be bought? In return, he got cash, more than anyone in Selkirk could imagine. But as the federal probe deepened, Selkirk itself began to unravel. Families who didn't like the attention packed up and left. Newcomers with no ties to the tragedy moved in. And Gabriel, he turned into a ghost, rarely seen outside his mansion, only ever spotted visiting the cemetery, where he'd built 7 marble headstones. With no bodies beneath them, his once thriving general store changed hands, its old ledgers conveniently destroyed. The sisters' belongings were boxed up, their art and writing forgotten, their very names slipping from daily life. By the spring of 1901, Selkirk was almost unrecognizable. The close-knit frontier town had become just another Western settlement, driven not by community, but by money and ambition. And the story of the 7 sisters? It was fading, just like the people who remembered it. But here's the thing. This wasn't the end, because 23 years later, in Chicago, one discovery would rip the case wide open. Again. And what investigators found would connect the Thornfield mystery to something much bigger than anyone in Selkirk could have ever imagined. So stick with me, because this story is far from over. Spring 1922. A crew tearing down an old warehouse on Chicago's south side makes a discovery they'll never forget. Behind false walls, sealed off for decades, was a hidden room. Inside, filing cabinets, boxes stacked to the ceiling, personal items that whispered of lives stolen, and among them, 7 photographs. Each picture showed one of the Thornfield sisters. But here's the catch. These weren't the same girls Selkirk remembered. These photos showed them years older, posed as if for professional portraits. Margaret looked like a woman in her 30s, her face lined with responsibility. Catherine wore fine clothes, the kind only money could buy. But her eyes told a story of sorrow no wealth could hide. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, they weren't side by side anymore. They'd been photographed separately, and the subtle differences in their features suggested lives lived apart, shaped by different paths. Sarah's image was almost haunting. Formal attire hinting at her ties to religion or charity, but her face heavy with a sadness that words couldn't capture. Grace, in her mid-20s, appeared professional, serious, but the spark, the brightness she'd once had, was gone. And Rebecca, the most heartbreaking of all, still young, still beautiful, but the joy that once made her beloved in Selkirk, erased. Detective John Sullivan of the Chicago Police was stunned. These photos weren't just family keepsakes. They were case files. Each came with detailed notes, personality traits, skills, even family background. It wasn't the work of someone who loved them. It was the work of a business. Because what Sullivan had stumbled onto was more than a mystery. It was an archive of a massive criminal network. This organization had been hiding in plain sight since the 1880s, running under respectable names, employment agencies, boarding schools, even charitable institutions. Their cover was flawless, but their true business? Exploiting frontier families who were desperate for opportunity, especially those with daughters. The scheme was cold, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. Well-dressed recruiters would arrive in small towns carrying letters of recommendation, official-looking contracts, and promises of wealth or education. They played on every weakness: poverty, social ambition, fear of the future. And once a family was hooked, backing out became impossible. Step by step, the daughters were separated. Sometimes the girls believed they were headed to a promising career in the city. Other times, their parents were convinced the girls had chosen independence, chasing success far away from home. But the truth was far darker. Sullivan's investigation tied it all back to Selkirk and to Gabriel Thornfield himself. The archive contained letters proving his connection to the group as early as 1893, his sudden wealth, his booming business. None of it had been chance. Gabriel had been working with this syndicate from the start, acting as their local contact in Montana. He found vulnerable families. He scouted opportunities. He opened the door, and in return, the organization made him rich. What this discovery revealed was staggering. The Thornfield sisters hadn't simply vanished into thin air. They'd been pulled into a machine, a criminal enterprise that thrived on secrecy, deception, and the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable. And the hidden room in Chicago. It was the smoking gun. But what Sullivan uncovered was just the beginning. The truth behind this network, and the fate of the sisters, was even darker than anyone could have imagined. So stay with me, because what comes next will shock. You imagine discovering that a father's darkest secret wasn't just failure. It was betrayal. The letters between Gabriel Thornfield and his powerful handlers revealed something chilling. At first, his role seemed small, just passing along gossip about local families, vouching for strangers who arrived in Selkirk with polished smiles and forged credentials. But little by little, Gabriel was pulled deeper. His intelligence, his influence in town, and most of all, his desperate dependence on the money they funneled him. It made him indispensable and dangerous. By 1899, Gabriel was cornered. Federal investigators were circling, neighbors were whispering, and the organization that had made him wealthy decided he was no longer an asset, he was a liability. Their demand was final, cold, unthinkable. If Gabriel wanted to keep his fortune and his family safe, he would have to surrender his own daughters. The letters show a man unraveling. Gabriel begged, pleaded, offered alternatives. More money, other families' daughters, even a complete relocation of his family far from Montana. but every offer was rejected. His handlers made it clear only his 7 daughters would satisfy the debt. The threats weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. Financial ruin, legal charges, violence, social destruction. The message was clear: resist, and you lose everything. The final notes in his correspondence, written just days before the sisters vanished, are heartbreaking. Gabriel had given in. He clung to one last hope, that his daughters would survive whatever came next, and one day forgive him. The letters claimed they would be well cared for, given fine lives, married into wealth, that their frontier virtues would be rewarded. But we know better, don't we? Just when the story seemed like it couldn't sink any deeper, it did. Detective Sullivan's revelation of Gabriel's involvement blew the case wide open. His discovery wasn't just about the Thornfields. It exposed a nationwide network. Law enforcement learned that this shadowy organization had operated for decades, stretching across the West. Their corruption reached everywhere: territorial governments, federal agents, even Congress. Judges were bribed to dismiss cases. Sheriffs were paid to silence families. Marshals turned a blind eye, looking the other way while daughters vanished. And the most disturbing part? Prominent politicians and business leaders, men who preached family values in public, were secretly complicit. They weren't just tolerating the network, they were profiting from it. The scale of it all was staggering. Investigators uncovered records showing more than 300 young women trafficked between 1885 and 1910. They weren't chosen randomly. Each was handpicked, based on beauty, intelligence, talent, or family ties that made them valuable in the underground marriage market. The system thrived on the frontier's weaknesses. Railroads gave traffickers speed and reach. Isolated towns made resistance nearly impossible, and families worn down by poverty, loneliness, and dwindling hope were easy prey for smooth-talking recruiters promising wealth and opportunity. What began as Gabriel Thornfield's personal tragedy now stood as proof of something far darker. A criminal empire that had destroyed hundreds of lives while hiding behind respectability, greed, and corruption. And as horrifying as it sounds, this was only the beginning. Have you ever seen a whole town's darkest secrets carved into marble? Because that's exactly what investigators discovered in Selkirk. And what it revealed about Gabriel Thornfield shook everyone to the core. The organization pulling the strings had always been clever. They preyed on weakness, families in debt, parents desperate for a future for their kids, or people tempted by promises that sounded too good to refuse. They didn't just offer opportunities. They tailored their pitch to every family, making the trap feel like a gift. Until it was too late. When the truth came out, Selkirk was split in two. Some demanded justice for the Thornfield sisters. Others begged for silence, terrified of what a full investigation might uncover. After all, Gabriel's wealth had built the town. The Rocky Mountain Development Company had poured money into businesses, railroads, even schools. The mayor, the banker, and half the merchants. They were all tied up in it, paid off to look the other way when questions started swirling about the sisters' disappearance. But then came the discovery that no one was ready for. Investigators went digging into the local cemetery records and realized the 7 marble headstones Gabriel had, erected for his daughters, weren't memorials of their deaths at all. They were records of their enslavement. Each date wasn't when a girl had died. It was when she had been forced into a marriage, shipped off to some distant city. Gabriel had known every single time. And instead of exposing the truth, he chose to keep up the illusion of tragedy. It wasn't grief carved into stone. It was complicity. That revelation destroyed the image of Gabriel as a broken victim. He wasn't just a grieving father. He had been part of the machine. And his suicide note, found years later in Denver, only deepened the tragedy. He admitted the guilt had driven him insane, but also confessed that he had held information that could have saved his daughters, if only he'd had the courage to come forward. And just when investigators thought the nightmare ended in 1910, they learned it hadn't. The network didn't disappear. It evolved. By the 1920s, the trafficking ring had disguised itself as legitimate businesses, employment agencies, matchmaking services, even social clubs. Same old exploitation, just dressed in modern clothes. This time, they weren't targeting isolated frontier towns. They went after immigrants, struggling city families, anyone beaten down by poverty or social upheaval. The real breakthrough came in the spring of 1922. Federal agents staged coordinated raids across a dozen states, over 200 officers, sweeping warehouses, offices, and homes. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Women were freed, dozens of them trapped for years in forced marriages or labor. But the paper trail they uncovered was even more chilling. Records of hundreds of missing women, names, dates, transactions. Proof that the Thornfield sisters hadn't vanished into legend. They'd been tracked, sold, and controlled like property. Take Margaret Thornfield. She was sent to Cleveland, handed over to Harrison Pembroke, a steel magnate who wanted a wife with education and refinement. On paper, it looked like a respectable marriage. In reality, she became his trophy. He paraded her intelligence, her poise, but kept her locked away from the world. She bore him 3 children, none of whom were ever told who she really was. To them, she was just an orphan with no family, and yet, Margaret never gave up. In secret, she kept journals. She documented everything: the abuse, the manipulation, the network's movements. Those hidden pages later became a weapon against the very people who had stolen her life. Catherine's fate was just as cruel, though in a different way. She was taken to Milwaukee and married off to Augustus Richardson, an art collector who didn't want a partner. He wanted a tool. Catherine was forced to paint for him, her work sold under his name, while she was kept isolated from any real community. Her talent was exploited, her voice silenced, and these were just 2 of the 7. The Thornfield tragedy wasn't just about one family anymore. It was proof of a machine that had consumed hundreds of lives. A network that adapted, thrived, and hid behind respectability. And the scariest part? Even after those raids in 1922, no one could say for sure it had really been stopped. So, what do you think? Was Selkirk cursed by Gabriel's betrayal, or by the greed of everyone who chose silence over truth? What if every painting in a mansion wasn't just art, but a silent scream? That's exactly what investigators found when they uncovered Catherine's work inside Richardson's home. Her skill was undeniable, masterful brushwork, beautiful detail. But beneath it all was raw pain, desperation, a soul crying out from captivity. By then, Catherine was living under the name Caroline Phillips. She survived by pouring her torment into her art, secretly dreaming of escape. But escape never came. She was watched constantly, threatened endlessly, trapped in a life she could never break free from. The torment of the Thornfield sisters didn't end with Catherine. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, were torn apart in one of the cruelest moves imaginable. They weren't just separated. They were deliberately split to destroy their bond, to strip away the one thing that gave them strength: each other. Eleanor was sent to St. Louis, forced into marriage with Marcus Whitfield, a businessman who wanted a wife efficient enough to run his household and charm his social circles. But losing her sister shattered her. Within months, Eleanor's grief pushed her into a complete mental breakdown. Elizabeth's path was no less tragic. She was taken to Chicago, married to Samuel Henderson, a banker who valued her grit and toughness, but cared nothing for her happiness. The lively, confident girl she once was faded. In her place was someone frightened, withdrawn, living in constant fear of punishment. And the cruelest twist? Both sisters were told the other was dead. That lie killed hope, ensuring they never tried to reach each other again. A standard tactic in the organization's playbook, designed to break the strongest bonds. Then there was Sarah. Her story still chills me. She was transported to Detroit, handed over to Reverend Jonathan Morrison, a minister admired by his congregation. But behind his sermons and piety was a man who had specifically ordered a wife with musical gifts and religious training. Sarah became his performer, singing in church, entertaining at events, all while he played the role of the devoted husband. The truth? He was abusive. Years of cruelty and neglect broke her health. In 1905, she died, officially from pneumonia. But investigators discovered the abuse had weakened her body to the point where she couldn't recover. Morrison didn't even try to save her. In fact, he seemed to welcome her death, so he could request another wife from the network. Grace's story hit hard in a different way. Brilliant with numbers, she was placed with Theodore Blackstone in Chicago. To him, she wasn't a wife, she was a tool. Her mathematical mind kept his fraudulent empire running, laundering money, cooking books, engineering scams that ruined countless families. But Grace fought back. She tried to sabotage him, sneaking in mistakes that might expose his crimes. Each time she was caught. Each time the punishments got worse. Eventually, her health gave out. In 1909, she died in childbirth, denied medical care, treated like an expendable asset rather than a human being. And then there was Rebecca, the youngest. Her fate may have been the cruelest of all. Too young for immediate placement, she spent years in holding facilities, shuffled from place to place, never allowed to form roots or friendships. By the time she was old enough, her health was already broken. Tuberculosis took her life in 1907. She died in a grim holding house, little more than a prison for discarded victims, who no longer served the organization's purpose. When the network was finally exposed in 1922, the trial shook the entire country. Newspapers printed every detail. The Thornfield case became a symbol, not just of one family's tragedy, but of the exploitation that had haunted frontier families for decades. And at the center of it all stood Marcus Peyton, the mastermind. He was dragged from his Chicago mansion in a raid that revealed staggering wealth, political ties, and evidence of his crimes. In court, he didn't show guilt, not even shame. He bragged. He described his trafficking empire as if it were a successful business model, boasting that he had provided a service to wealthy men seeking refined frontier. Wives, cold, calculated, completely devoid of empathy. Even seasoned court reporters admitted they'd never seen anything like it. And in that moment, the world finally saw him for what he truly was. Not just a criminal, but a sociopath who built an empire on the destruction of hundreds of lives. And yet, the darkest question remains. Did networks like his really vanish after his downfall? Or did they simply adapt, slipping back into the shadows, waiting for their next victims? 17 men. That's how many of Pemberton's closest allies stood trial beside him. Their charges? Kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, corruption of officials, and the evidence. It was damning. Courtrooms across the country heard shocking testimony about how sophisticated this operation had been, and just how deep the corruption went. For years, powerful men had hidden in plain sight, their crimes protected by destroyed evidence, silenced witnesses, and the sudden deaths of anyone who might talk. But here's the chilling part. Many of the most powerful conspirators, including politicians, judges, and wealthy businessmen, walked free. Money and connections shielded them from prison, even if their reputations were permanently shattered. And then came the hardest decision of all, the moment the surviving Thornfield sisters were asked to testify. Think about it. After decades of captivity, abuse, and stolen lives, would you risk everything again to tell the truth? Or would you stay silent to protect the fragile life you'd managed to rebuild? Margaret, living under the name Mary Patterson, was the only one who stepped forward. At 49 years old, she stood in that courtroom, faced her captors, and spoke about the 23 years they had stolen from her. Her testimony wasn't just powerful, it was groundbreaking. She described the psychological torture, the loss of freedom, the scars that never healed. And because of her, new legal protections for women and families were finally written into law. But not every sister could bear that weight. Catherine, now Caroline Phillips in Milwaukee, had children of her own who knew nothing about her past. Revealing her story would have destroyed their lives. So she stayed silent. Elizabeth, living as Ellen Pierce in St. Louis, never recovered from being torn away from her twin sister. Reliving her nightmare in public was something she simply couldn't survive, and so both women chose silence. Investigators respected that choice. They knew these women had already given enough. As for Selkirk, the town itself, its soul never healed. Families left, unwilling to stay in a place built on such betrayal. By 1925, the Thornfield mansion was torn down. Where it once stood, only an empty lot remained. The cemetery's 7 headstones were replaced with a single stone monument to the 7 sisters, victims of greed and betrayal. May truth finally set you free. That monument was paid for by people all across Montana, strangers who had read their story and wanted the world to remember. But the Thornfield tragedy didn't just scar one small town, it reshaped the entire country. Because of this case, missing person investigations changed forever. Federal laws were passed requiring oversight of shady employment agencies and matchmaking services. States began working together on criminal cases, sharing information in ways they never had before. And maybe most importantly, the case revealed something bigger. something uglier. The truth that economic desperation and isolation made entire communities vulnerable to predators. Families believed the lies because they wanted so badly to believe their daughters were being given opportunities. In reality, they were being sold like property. The Thornfield sisters weren't just victims of one man. They were victims of a society that looked the other way as long as there was profit to be made. Yet out of all this horror came lessons that reshaped America. Margaret's bravery set legal precedents that protected others. The investigation gave law enforcement new tools and strategies to fight trafficking, and the sisters' story became a warning, a reminder of what happens when greed and power matter more than human life. So ask yourself this: was everything really revealed? Or are there still secrets buried in old files, conspiracies that never came to light, families who suffered the same fate but were never found? The evidence suggests the network was even larger than anyone proved in court, which means the Thornfields may not have been the only family destroyed. What do you think? Could there still be untold stories hidden out there? Drop your theories in the comments, and if this tale of hidden history gripped you, hit like, share it with someone who loves a good mystery, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because trust me, the past still has secrets waiting to be uncovered.